So we have today's class is Introduction to Next.JS. Let me tell you a little bit actually about IntegrateDetroit. The mission of IntegrateDetroit is to bridge the gap that exists for people to get into technology, to learn some new concepts and break into maybe the job market in web development and kind of the adjacent roles around that. So we teach things from intro to Next.js to Python, and I think we had a second level Python class. We did a class, I think a month and a half ago on LangChain, introducing people to LangChain and how it helps you develop towards LLMs and some AI concepts. So if you're not subscribed already, subscribe and follow along with some of our future classes that we have going on. Okay, so a little bit about me. I'm a senior software engineer with Integral. I have been writing code for a long time. I'm not going to say how many years, but it's a long time. And I'm an AI enthusiast. The last year or so, I've really picked up on machine learning a little bit and computer vision, ChatGPT concepts, and things like LangChain and building around LLMs. I'm an adventure seeker, kind of. I almost didn't put that in there. I'm really an introvert, but I do like to go out and do new things, from skydiving to climbing down buildings in Detroit to just visiting new places. And I'm also a husband and a doggy daddy. So I have two dogs, Grizz and Jax, and a wife, and they all mean the world to me. So that's a little bit about me. Let's get into our agenda. This class is it's set from 10 a.m. to noon. We may not use all the time. We have had occasion where we've gone over by a little bit, and it really kind of depends on the flow of things. If anyone has a lot of questions, I had a small goof with the registration where it started a little bit late, so we may have a lighter class today because of that. And it may go a little quicker, and if we go quicker, that's fine too. We may end at 11:45, 11:30, something like that. It really depends on how the flow goes and what questions come up, and if we decide at the end of the coding session to try something else or any of that. But the agenda here is to talk about the overview and history of Next.js, the key features and benefits, ideal use cases, a couple limitations and challenges, and then we'll create a simple app together. It's not going to be a lot, but we're going to explore some of the things that we talked about in that should be about maybe the first hour. And then we'll start writing some code. And we'll just explore some of those concepts and try them out in real time here and from scratch. And then we'll talk about some of the options. It says deployment options here, but this slide really should say, what's next. And then we'll do a Q&A and then everyone can go eat lunch. And we will have a couple of people joining. We usually have people join a little after 10, which is fine too. All right, so let's dive in. What is Next.js? So Next.js it's a toolkit built on top of React to help developers build more complex, high-performing web applications more easily. So it gives us an easier way to get into development quickly, to start building our app very quickly. And it also builds on a lot of tools like built-in page routing, API routing, support for server-side rendering, and static site generation. So you can actually have a static site or a server-side rendered static page. And in the same application, you can also have dynamic pages that are rendered on the client side. And it also builds in some optimizations and some more things like that. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of that stuff as we go on. Welcome, Ravina. And it works out of the box with minimal configuration. So that's kind of what I was talking about with that it gets us set up and running really, really quickly. And we'll see that as we start in the code portion. We will have a working application that doesn't do anything we want it to do, but a working application nonetheless, in something like 15 seconds if it has to install a couple things. Really, really quick. Yeah, and it streamlines developer workflow, and there is a little bit with workflow about Next.js, with the structure and workflow that can be a little different from other frameworks. So if you're used to other frameworks, some of it may seem a little different, may seem a little off. And some people may find that they don't like how Next.js does things, and some people like it a lot more than other frameworks and structures. So that's kind of up to you to decide. Figure that out as you go. So a little bit about the history. It was designed, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I want to touch on it a little bit. It was designed and co-authored by Guillermo Rauch, who is a CEO of Vercel. And it was formerly known as Zeet. I think that's the right pronunciation. And it was originally introduced in October of 2016. So it's really not, in the scheme of things, it's not super old when you think about things like Python and Rust and some other frameworks that are out there. But it has a lot of modern concepts with it. It was designed to simplify the server-side rendering end of things in React. And it was they introduced the static site generation in 2020 with version 9.3. So that's even newer. But that is an option that allows you, we'll talk about it a little bit more later, but it allows you to generate things so that it's more optimized and loads faster. And then open source, they made it open source, and it gained a lot of rapid support and adoption that way. So there's really good community around Next.js, which is a really, really important thing to look at whenever you choose a tool. If you're just doing a proof of concept, you just want to flesh something out to see what it would look like, probably less important. But if you're anything like me, I'll do a proof of concept, and then I'll be building on that for the next year, and it becomes the first version, the MVP of my app. So I always look at what kind of community support any tool I use has, because I don't want to rip a tool out later if I have problems or the developer just stopped working on it or whatever. So that's important to me, and it should be something that you look at for things that you develop. And then there are some notable websites, and I think Julianne has a link that she can drop in chat about this build that I put more here in the slide deck. There's some notable websites that are built with Next.js, like Nike and OpenAI and ChatGPT, Spotify, and some other things. So that's a little bit about where it came from, where it's headed, where it is today. Let's talk about some of the features. So, excuse me. So one of the features is the pages router, which we won't really dive in too much today, but we'll talk about it in terms of the history of Next.js. It's the original router that came with Next.js. And the way it worked is it was file-based. So think about other frameworks. You have to create a whole routes file. You have to create a router, right? And that router, you have to say, if someone goes to this URL, you want to load this page and do it in this way from this file. Next.js doesn't work that way. It says if you put inside the pages directory, if you put a file called home, and then you go to your website /home, that's the file that's going to load. It's going to load home.js. So that's one of the things that they did to design it to be a little bit easier to get up and running. You don't have to worry about the routing. It's all built in. And they've done a lot of things like that. But it is file-based in that way. There is one kind of, not caveat or exception, but one kind of rule to that routing, which is API. If you have an API directory, the API directory is used to build endpoints. So you would have /API/users and that routes to the pages/API/users.js. And that's used for building on API. And what's different about that, we'll get into the API a little bit more later, is the API itself has some actually does require a router so that you can handle things like get, posts, etc. And so it's handled a little bit differently from normal pages. And then pages are statically rendered by default, but you can opt into server-side rendering or ISR either way. Okay, so then they introduced the app router. That came a little bit later. That's the one we're going to explore a little bit today. And the app router was a new paradigm that was introduced in version 13 of Next.js, which isn't that long ago. I think we're 14, 15 now, somewhere in there. And it's also file-based like Page.js. So it was very similar in how it's implemented and how it's used, but it's a little different in what it offers. So it offers some additional things that you can take advantage of, and we'll get into some of that a little bit later too. So it works the same way, except that your files get stored in app. So inside your application, there's an app directory, and inside the app directory, you have maybe with the same example we used before, you might have a directory called home. So it'd be app/home/ something else like about us. So your URL would be /home/about us. Or actually using the example we said before, it would be /app/home.js. So the home.js file. And that would be served when you go to your web browser and put in your URL, be like localhost 3000/home. So it's very similar, very easy to kind of go from the old way of doing it to the new way, which made it super handy for people who had been using Next.js for a while. But it's really not a whole lot different for anyone coming in new. We can really just kind of dive right in with the app router. It does offer hierarchical. If you watch me in other videos, I never get that word on the first try. Hierarchical UI structures and parallel routing. We'll get into that, what that means in a little bit. That may not make sense to people right away. And if it doesn't, don't worry, we'll get to it. And then it also supports React server components and middlewares. We're not going to dive into middlewares and React server components right away, or I don't think we're going to get into that today. Maybe if we had a bunch of extra time, we might do it. I haven't prepared it. So if we have a lot of extra time and people want to do it, we might dig in a little bit there. Okay, I'm trying to check myself a little bit on my time here to make sure that I'm flowing along at the pace I wanted to do. But here's kind of an example screenshot that shows what that structure might look like for an app router or a pages router. And you can see they're pretty similar. One thing to note in this screenshot, I don't know if it's real easy to see or not, it's kind of small. But in this screenshot, we have an API folder under pages, and we don't show that under app, but it's absolutely something you can do under app. It's not restricted to just the pages router. Okay, so in this example, though, you can see kind of you have nested routes and even more nested, and how that works with a page.tsx. They're using TypeScript in this. We had TypeScript in this one. We have a question.
Yes, we do have a question from Ravina. So I'm new to ISR. Can you give a brief about it? How is it different than SSR?
Sure. Yeah, I think I can do that. So,
But it might be CSR. Ravina, are you able to come off mute and let us know?
so
Hello.
Yes, hello.
So in one of the previous slides, I saw that it was SSR and ISR. So I'm very new to ISR. So can you give like what is the differentiator between SSR and ISR? Because I have worked with SSR, but I'm not sure what does ISR mean.
Sure, let me move my chat window out of the way. Yeah, so ISR is I believe, I hope I don't embarrass myself. I believe the acronym stands for incremental site rendering. So the idea is that with ISR, it can reload a portion of the page or a component without reloading the whole page. And I think in my demo, actually, it does warn me that it reloads the whole page. So there's maybe some tweaking that I'll have to do. So the code might not be the best code in our demo for showing that. But it allows us, so let's say you build a page and you have several components and you have those components all separated out. Incremental site rendering will re-render one portion of the page if that portion changed, but not re-render the whole page.
Okay, it's pretty clear now. Thank you so much.
And by contrast, server-side rendering is going to render everything at once before it's delivered to the browser. And then you get what you get delivered to the browser from the server is going to be rendered HTML that's already you know, in its latest form and doesn't actually get updated. And a lot of times you're going to use something like you're going to use CSR or ISR kind of patterns where your stuff will get updated incrementally or the whole page gets updated instead of just doing static. But if you were doing something really simple, it might all just be static pages. You may not need to be pulling data from a database or updating anything in real time. You don't have a stock ticker or anything running. Then the page is just going to be a static. You know, if you had a website for poetry, that's an example where all your pages are probably going to make sense to be static. You don't have any interaction or any updating that's happening on those pages. Then you'll get some benefit out of rendering the HTML and sending it to the browser. And you'll probably see some caching benefits and things that you can do there. Okay, so
Thank you.
and I think I did get, yeah, I got the I think I got the maybe I got the acronym wrong. I see incremental static rendering chat. Okay, thanks for the question. I'm glad that you asked it because a lot of times one person will ask the question and there may be two or three people who also had the same question or didn't know that they wanted to know that. And it helps them out as well. Okay, so let's go to the next slide here in our features. So one of the other features is some styling support that's offered by Next.js. So you can have a global CSS file, and we'll kind of see a little bit about how that works. Maybe, well, we might dive into CSS, might not. But you can also have CSS modules. So if you're familiar with some development patterns, you might have a pattern where you have a global CSS file and it gets compacted with something like Sass so that it loads quicker. But what happens is, even though all the CSS code is compacted and it makes it a smaller file to load, you still might be loading like a 100K file when you don't need 100K worth of CSS. And it loads on every page, right? So that's a pattern that's existed in the past and still prevalent for many sites. But with things like CSS modules, if you had an example of the page we built where it's home.js, you might build a home.module.css file into that same app directory. And that is the CSS module that is only going to load for that home page. Or if you had a users page, right, you might have a CSS file like a users.module.css, and that's only going to load for the users page. So when you go to the home page, all that user CSS doesn't get loaded up. So there's support for that, and it also gives you the benefit of locally scoped classes. So if you had a class for H1 tags, you don't have to get specific and name it user H1 tag or whatever, right? You can just style H1 tags in your user module, CSS module. And it's locally scoped just to the user page. And then when you go to the home page, the H1 tags are not affected by that CSS. So there's things like that. Helps you avoid conflicts, and it's more maintainable. If you've ever gone into an application that you're building and you work on it for a year, and before you know it, the CSS, you have one global CSS file and it's 1,000, 2,000 lines long. That becomes a nightmare, and it gets disorganized really, really quickly when you want to add just one class. And you don't know where to put it, and you just throw it at the bottom or whatever. Like I'm mentioning some really bad patterns. Don't do those things. But this helps if you kind of get stuck in those things where you end up with really big files. You can avoid some of that by having modules. And then they offer support also for CSS in JS, which is kind of a pattern that I'm not really fond of, but it helps when you're just trying to test things. It also has its use cases, but it allows you to put CSS directly in JavaScript components. And like I said, there's some use cases. We won't go into those today. And then Julian posted a link in chat for Tailwind CSS. Tailwind CSS is something that I learned about maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, that makes styling really, really easy. They build a whole lot of tools around, just building a card on the page with rounded borders. Like, instead of figuring out all that CSS to make that work, they've done all that for you, and you can say, give it a card class, a Tailwind card class, or something like that. It is super useful unless you're doing something, building something that needs to be integrated in something else and has a lot of user configurable customizations and complexity. I won't go into all of that, but for most people, Tailwind is really, really helpful and useful. And they built Next.js with some really good support for Tailwind being integrated really easily. So bookmark that link, or we'll share out the slide deck too, and it has these links. And then Sass, which is a preprocessor for CSS. We kind of touched on that a little bit, where it can squash down CSS and do some additional things like offer variables. So I don't know if I really want to get too much into variables, but essentially it's a way to make your styles a little bit more customizable based on what's going on, right? So if you have say you have two different types of users, a regular user and admin, and maybe you want the H1 tags to show up in a specific color if you're logged in as an admin. So you can have kind of variables around those things without changing the page itself, right? And then there's nested rules and mix-ins, and those are concepts maybe for another talk. Okay, so moving on, we have some additional optimization features, and they come in the form of, well, the built-in components are one of the forms of them. So you have, there's more than these three, but we'll just go over these three for today. And these three, we're going to at least experiment with some code with image and link to show you how those work. And there's another link dropped in as well. Thank you, Julian, about some additional components that Next.js offers. So if you want to research that a little bit more after the class. So the image tag, the image component here is built on the traditional HTML image tag, but it offers some additional support for like lazy loading and automatic image resizing based on device size and those kind of things. So imagine you use the regular image tag and then you try and pull your site up on mobile and it looks horrible because the image is off the screen and all of that. It handles things like that for you out of the box. So again, Next.js kind of trying to do some of the heavy lifting for you. But at the expense perhaps of you have to kind of get into the habit of using the image component instead of the image tag, which is, it's a bit of a, you have to get used to it. You have to remind yourself a little bit. May come faster for some other people than for me. I had to remind myself. And then you have a link tag, right? So the link tag, as you might guess, is a take on the href pattern that you used to in HTML, where say href source equals and or href equals, sorry, and you give it a URL, right? And then that provides a link on the page that people can click on. Well, the link tag does the same thing for you, but the big, I think the big thing that it does here that is really beneficial is it prefetches any pages that are identified in link tags. So if you have a home page, and then on your home page you have an About Us page, linked from home to About Us, and your About Us page has a bunch of content and some images and those kind of things. While someone's viewing your homepage, it's going to go out and prefetch the About Us page so that when they click on that, it's seamless. It's super fast. So there's no going out and requesting the page when they click on it because it's already in memory. So that can be handy to use. And if you don't want it to do that, you just don't use that link component. And then there's a script component, which is, again, like the other two mentioned here, it's built upon the native script tags, but it gives you more control over loading and execution of third-party scripts. And I don't think we get into that really in the code, but that's, you can follow that link in chat and kind of read more on some of those things. And then there's some font optimizations as well, where you can kind of self-host Google fonts, and it will reduce the layout shift by automatically generating some fallbacks and some things like that. Again, you can kind of read in the documentation a little bit deeper on that stuff. Probably won't get into that too much here. So we'll continue on more optimizations, right? The Next.js offers automatic code splitting. So what it does is it automatically splits up your code by pages. And that provides a means for not loading everything up all at once, right? So it's kind of like the CSS modules, same kind of benefit there. And then also there's prefetching, and I think I had actually some more notes about that. That's something that I wanted to remind myself to say about the code splitting. No, I didn't. That was it. And we'll kind of look at some of this stuff as we code too. And then there's prefetching, which we just kind of mentioned, right, where it will prefetch anything that's in a link component, so that it doesn't take time to load it at the time of the click. Okay, so moving on to ideal use cases, and I think we're running a little ahead. This can be a shorter class today potentially, but that said, feel free to ask some questions, and it might give us a little bit more room to do some things with code. We'll see. Ideal use cases. So we have content-heavy websites, like blogs, marketing websites, portfolio pages, like I mentioned, maybe a poetry site. Those kind of things are pretty ideal, where you're going to use maybe static page rendering, static site rendering, and just generate everything on the server side and hand off HTML, just plain HTML over to the browser. So that's a good use case for it. And then you have, dynamic and interactive apps, so e-commerce, customer portals, so those kind of things. Where you have server-side rendering is ideal for handling content. And then anything with an API, this is a big use case for me, where I'll have an app that I want it to be interactive, have a database and that kind of thing. I don't want to just make database calls all over the place in my code. For me, I think it's a better pattern, and it's more scalable to build out an API, because then let's say your site blows up, right? You're building a proof of concept for some kind of startup, and you're startup idea and it takes off. You want to be able to scale quickly. And if you already have all of your data calls built into an API pattern, an API within your application, then you can just easily split that API into its own separately hosted, separately served thing that you can tweak settings on aside from your content site. So there's some advantages there to have having the API built in. And it just makes it easier, right? You're in your one code base and you're writing your code and you're like, oh, I need to hit the API. I need to hit the database for something. You can quickly fire up a few API endpoints that serve that need without having to get into like a whole new API framework or anything like that. We'll go through this one slide, this next slide, and then we'll pause for a second. So limitations and challenges. There is a bit of a learning curve. Like I said, it's not this new features and magic. There's things that some people aren't used to. So there might be a little bit of, going back and forth, reading the documentation a little bit, understanding how some of it works. I actually use Copilot and some auto completions and things like that that help me out because I don't have to remember syntax. Although it's good to go through the documentation and remember syntax. And if you use any auto completions, I'll say this in other talks all the time. Any auto completions, copy paste. It's been the same for years. If you're copying and pasting from Stack Overflow or from some tutorial, read the code, understand every line of the code. And if you don't understand it, with GPTs now, you can feed it a piece of code and say, hey, tell me what this does. And it makes it so much easier. But however you get the code, however it ends up in your IDE or on your server, make sure you understand all the code that you're putting in there. So whatever tools you use, always go through the code, and we'll use I have Copilot. It's going to fill some things in, some of it's going to get wrong or make bad assumptions, and we'll change it. But either way, we'll go through the code. We'll take some time with it, especially we have the time to do it here today. I do see something in chat. Let me see. Since we're almost at a pause point, I'll just read it real quick. Started with development earlier this year in January with Angular and TypeScript. After a few years working on mobile apps, and now I'm wondering which framework to use with my web projects. Moving forward, my projects usually contain integration with Firebase and Google Cloud. It's a really good question. Like I said, the learning curve, you're going to find some differences between Next.js and Angular. And there's definitely differences between like using TypeScript and not using TypeScript. And I like TypeScript. It has a lot of advantages. If you're trying to move quickly, sometimes you might do it without, but I would always like, if you're going to use it, use it. But I think that comes back to kind of this limitations learning curve, right? You're gonna have a curve to pick up Next.js versus something that you've already worked in like that. But I would say I think it's valuable to try it anyway. Try it, see if you like it, and even try just a couple of dummy apps with it that you're not going to use, but you want to get a feel for it, right? Like build a poetry site and see how static pages work, or fire up a collection in Firebase of book recommendations and then build a page that lists those out or something like that, right? Build something super simple, something that you could whip up in a day and just experiment and see what you like and don't like. I found that's the best way to really get familiar with which frameworks to use. But also nowadays you can also do things like go into ChatGPT or another LLM and ask it to compare frameworks. And you may find that that it says, well, framework X doesn't support this thing, well, framework Y does, and you're like, wow, I know I'm going to need that later, right? So those are handy to do. You don't have to do it in an LLM. There's people put out blog posts like that all the time comparing frameworks. So that's another way you can look into it. Yeah, it comes down to, you're right, it does come down a little bit to personal preference, maybe a little bit in the timeline. just try not to get locked into, this is more for languages, but try not to get locked into, well, this is the tool I know is a hammer, so everything's a nail. I'm going to use a hammer on it. Make sure you know about other frameworks, right? Like know about Next.js or Angular or other possible frameworks and types of code, because some may be more suited to your need than others, and you don't want to be shoehorning Next.js into your application if it's not good for it, if it's not ideal. But it does work for a lot of different things, so you probably won't find that too much. Okay, great question. Thanks for sharing that. All right, so we had another half of this slide, which is opinionated framework. We kind of just talked about some of that a little bit, right? Rendering, routing, rendering strategies, tight coupling with front end and back end code. That could be a deal breaker for some people. You know, where you have these file patterns, for example, that your homepage is home.js, right? That's going to be, for some people, that's like, no, I can't do it. For other people, as long as it works and there is a pattern that they can follow and the code's easy to find and modify and run, then it's not a problem, right? So it comes down a lot actually to personal preference and kind of some of your standards about what you need in a framework. And you know, it can be off-putting to some people, and other people would be like, this is great, this is exactly how I want to do it. So we kind of had a little bit of a pause. Why am I not? Let me get my focus back over here. Okay, we had a little bit of a pause. Now it's time to write some code. We're running ahead a little bit where I talk fast sometimes, so maybe that's a benefit, but I'm going to take a breath and give some space for anyone who maybe felt like they didn't want to interrupt. You can always interrupt, feel free. But in case you felt like that and you had some questions, let's take a second to allow for any questions. And in the meantime, so we're not just sitting here doing nothing, you can start building out your app framework with this command that's on screen. It's npx, n like Nancy, px, or n like node maybe, space create dash next dash app space next dash demo. There is also a pattern where right at the end of the word app, you might put @latest, or you can specify version and that kind of thing. I don't think we'll need to. So I'm actually going to switch over to code. There is a couple of things that popped up when I was running through this again last night, where like it may ask you to install a package, right? On this computer, I didn't have that package, and so you just say yes. But let's jump over to code. We don't need any more slides for a little while here, so I'm going to jump over to code. You should be able to see my code screen. I actually have two terminals open, and I'm going to make a note right now about this because it was something that came up last night, and I kind of made a guess, and I was right. I use ZSH for my terminal all the time. If you use ZSH, there's a command in here that we're going to run that won't work. But it will work in Bash, so you can just drop to Bash for this stuff. And I ran across this last night, like last minute somehow, and I didn't come up with a workaround for it. If you find a workaround or you know a workaround, feel free to mention it, but I didn't want to spend a lot of time on that. Easy fix is to just drop to Bash for this one command if you need to. So I'm going to do it without latest because that's what I told you to do. And I want to see the same thing you're seeing. And if we have questions, we'll stop along the way. Also, through this whole coding portion, if anything's going too quickly, I'm going to try not to run too quickly through it. But if you need a second, don't get left behind. Raise your hand, throw something in chat, whatever, and let us know. We can stop for a second and let you catch up. As a a slow typer sometimes. That's something I run into. Okay, so when I install, it's asking me, hopefully you all can read this a little bit. If I want to install TypeScript, I actually, for this demo, we can, I think, just burn through this with default. Just hit enter and take the default. If you don't want the default, you can use the left and right arrow keys to change your mind. We'll say no to that. We'll say no to Tailwind. We're not actually going to do Tailwind in this demo, so that's fine. We can say no to all this stuff, but we do want the app router, and it defaults to yes. I'm not really sure why you would say no, but anyway, so I'm just going to pick defaults for all of these things. And then it's going to build out my framework structure for me. Now, you get a sneak peek into some of my old class structure here, but here's the next demo folder that it created. And you remember in the command, the last part of the command was next-demo. That's the name of your application that you're telling it to create. So let's switch back for a second. I want to talk about this real quick. For those who aren't familiar, sometimes I forget, like, I've been doing this a while. Some of this may be new to some people. What you can
have to install to run npx command.
Oh yeah, that's a great point, right? So if you don't have npx, you'll need to install npx. I forget the exact command, but we're gonna look that up real quick. npn has a page about npx, and it's part of the npm CLI. So if you install npm, you get npx by default. If you don't have npm, you can install npm. Where is it install? That's funny. I thought it was going to be right here. It's been forever since I installed npm, so I apologize. If someone does have it off the top of their head, feel free to throw it in chat as well, which may save us a little bit of time. But there we go, getting started.
Okay.
Yeah. This goes into like creating your account and some things. So this is actually a good question. Does anyone not have npm? I think we did mention that that like npm and IDE and stuff would be good to have ahead of the class. But if you don't have it, that's fine too, and we can kind of help work through that. So I'll put that out there. If anyone doesn't have it, raise your hand or speak up and let us know, and we can pause and kind of get through that. But if everyone does have it, then we'll continue on. It is a good point, and I'm glad you brought that up. So thanks for coming off mute to mention that.
Yeah, I don't have that component.
Oh, you don't have npm? Okay.
Well, just go ahead anyway. I'll watch the recording to catch back up.
Okay. Yeah, I honestly I don't remember how much of a thing it'll be to install npm. I don't recall it being super involved, but we'll keep going, and then if there's anything you want to ask about in the code, just feel free to stop me, and we'll stop and describe things, especially if you're unable to follow along. But what npx does is it allows you to run an application without actually downloading it. So in this case, we're running an application called create-next-app, which is what they've developed to help you build out an application. So you don't have to build out all this directory structure and download a bunch of things. It does all that for you. And then the parameter at the end is next-demo. That is just telling it what to name your app. So it's going to create a directory. Wrong key. There we go. It's going to create a directory that is named after what you told it to name it. Thank you, Jacob. That's what I was thinking. So yeah, when you install Node, it's going to install that for you. Like I said, it has been forever, right? So so in chat, Jacob posted this link to Node.js, right? In Node.js, when you install it, it's going to have all that for you. So if you don't have Node, you can install it this way. And if I recall, it comes with NPM now. It didn't used to. So you can follow instructions on this on the Node.js site to install Node. Okay, so moving on, let me hit the right key this time. So what that first command does is it creates this directory for you, this next-demo directory, or whatever you call your application. And then it's going to create an app directory, and it has a bunch of stuff already built out for you in the app directory, just some real boilerplate things that you might need to use throughout your app. And then so you have like a layout.js, and we'll get into that in a few. Your global CSS file, your fave icon. Every website's supposed to have one of those, or it'll complain in console. I never do that until the end, but it builds one out for you. And then an example of a module, this is what I was talking about with modular CSS. There's a page.module.css file in here. We'll get into all of that. We'll leave that open. We have Node modules. Whenever you use Node, any of the components that you install get thrown in a Node modules folder. And then you have a public directory where you can put things like images. There's a couple in here. I'm actually going to move this. I'm going to put this MacBook image inside public. We're going to use that later. So I'll just drag it in there now. So anything that you want to be publicly accessible can go in there, like images and that kind of thing. So yeah, it builds out a whole bunch of stuff for you and some configurations. And we're not going to get into all of it. There is a README that gives you a little bit of description about how to use Next and some documentation, but you can also just go to the website that it creates. So let's get into the next steps here, right? So if you didn't have an app directory, you'd want to make one, but it builds that for you. We are going to install Sass. I don't know how much we're going to use it, but let's just show how to install that, right? So npm is how you manage your packages, your node modules, and we want to use one called Sass. So we'll do npm install Sass, and it'll install that for us. And you'll find that as you develop, you may find some cool tool that you want to use, and it'll have an instruction like that that maybe tells you to run npm install whatever, and it installs it. And then what happens is it puts it in the node modules directory. So now there's a should be a Sass in here. I don't know what the pattern is. It might be under something else, but it'll put it in there once it installs it. Yeah, so we may or may not need Sass. I'm installing it just to kind of show you how that works. And then we want to create a styles directory. Well, let's skip that. We'll use the global styles that exist today. We don't need to do an additional directory. There's already a global styles here. We're going to use this one. Whoops, I opened the image up. So my screen sharing tools are getting in the way here. We don't need fave icon. Okay. So yeah, so we already have a global CSS file. We don't need another one. So I guess what we're going to do next is let's go into our let's go into, I actually made some notes about some code I want to write, and I think we'll skip some of it because it's not really, it's kind of like how to use CSS and stuff. I don't think we need to do all that since it's not a CSS class. But what we can do is we can take a look at layout.js and see what's in there, just so we get a baseline of what it looks like, because we're going to go change it later. But I want to kind of describe what layout.js does. So layout.js, let me move this. There we go. My Zoom tools are kind of in the way. Okay. So layout.js, what it does for you is it kind of, well, I mean, it's right in the name, right? It provides a default layout for how all of your pages in the site will look. So if you want to have headers and footers, like let's say you want a menu and it's, your menu is going to be on every single page. You want, a footer on every page with like maybe an about us link and a copyright or something. You can add those in your layout, and we will do that in a little bit. But you can also do things like, here we have metadata with a title and a description. I'm not sure I would put that as, I mean, that can be changed like per page, but then like the meat of it here is, oh, my tooltips are getting in the way. The meat of it here is we have an HTML tag and a body tag. And inside the body tag, we have a class name and a children parameter, so it'll display any children pages of that. But we'll adjust this in a little bit to show how we're going to add a menu to each page. I don't think we'll get into a footer unless someone wants a second example of that. Anyway, so that's what that looks like. So let's create a new page. Let's create a page called my notes are kind of weird. Let's do it a different way than my notes say. Let's create a page called About Us. So we're gonna have I'm actually gonna do I'm totally breaking away from what my notes say, and that's fine. We have plenty of time. So I'm gonna go kind of ad hoc here, or ad lib rather. And inside app, I'm just gonna create a file called about.js. And actually, let's do this. Yeah, no, let's do it there. Let's do about.js. Did I do that right? About.js. And inside that file, we're going to create a function that is going to serve as the content for this page. So we'll do export. And I'm going to have some things rapidly auto-completing. Don't freak out. I will pause and we'll go back and go through all of the code. Like I said, we want to understand what all of our code does. I want to call it, yeah, actually, I do want to call it about. Let's do that. And then we'll say we want it to return something, right? So the way this works is we tell it to return, and we're going to give it some HTML to return. So in this case, it's going to be div. It's actually auto-completing less than I thought it would, which is fine. But here it wants to autocomplete this About Us page for us, which is fine. So we'll do that. And then we need to wrap this up, right? It's still open-ended. So we need this trailing bracket, which it's suggested for me. There we go. So let's walk through this code. It'll give you a chance to type it out if you're not using Copilot or something that's going to autocomplete that much for you. It's very handy, but it's also I probably should have turned it off for this. Thanks for the chat comments. Yeah, and feel free to join back in too if you have to step out and join back in. It will be recorded. It'll be on YouTube too. Okay, so in here, what we're doing is we're saying this is our default function of how the page gets served, what content gets served for it. And what we're going to do is we're going to send it, we're going to send out to the browser this div element. And inside div, we want a header that says about us and some content, a content paragraph that says this is the about us page. I don't know why it matters to me, but I'm going to put us in there. Yeah, and that's it. Super simple page. Let's just save it and look. So here's the way this works is we actually need to run this. I forgot a step. Let's take a step back here, right? So we need to do npm run, and we're going to say dev. And this is, I should probably take a step into really quickly the package JSON. I hadn't planned for this, but we have the time for it. So the way Node works, Next is all of this is running on Node with npm. The way it works is you have this package file that describes your application and allows for things that work with your application, defines dependencies, things that are needed in your application. It's a little bit more involved than what we're dealing with today, but I will show in here we have a section called scripts, and these are things that you can run. So you can run your app normally with like start, or you can run it in a development mode, which is what we're going to do today. And the difference with development mode is that anytime a new file exists or a file changes, it's automatically going to update the page. Obviously, you wouldn't necessarily want that in that kind of polling happening in a production app or a normal run of the app. But for development, it's very handy because as we change files, and you'll see it as we're working on the code, as we change a file, it's going to automatically reload the page and reload that file for us. So that's the one we're going to run. It's called Next.Dev, and it just tells Next.js to run it in a way that watches for any changes and then automatically updates. So we'll run npm run. So the way we run that script is npm run, and we're going to say the script we want, which is dev, and that will run our development server. Or it will fail. So why is this, did I type it wrong? What did I do here? I don't know why it says the script is missing for some reason. Even though I can see it there. Let me try with next, just by default. So if I say next dev, oh, so the problem that we're having here is it's complaining that it doesn't see next. So what I'm going to do here, and you'll run into things like this occasionally too, where you're trying to get something to work, and just always look at what the error is and try different ways, right? So what I did here is I just took a shortcut to what this run script does, and I just ran it directly by typing next dev. And when I ran next dev, I can see what the real error is, which is that we don't have next installed. Even though we built an app, we don't have next itself installed. So I'm going to run npm install next. And you may find this is a great example. I'm glad this happened, because what can happen is you'll see a tutorial about how to use some cool thing like Tailwinds or something else. And maybe the tutorial will miss, or you'll just overlook it, the instruction on how to actually install it so it can be used. So this is a good kind of intro to debugging that, right? So now if I were to do npm run dev, it's going to try and run the script. No, it's not. Okay, hold on. It says it added it, so I'm not sure what is missing here. Well, we'll take a second to figure this out. So this says command is not found next. I wonder why that's. Am I in the right directory? Ha, I'm not. So the problem is I'm in the wrong directory, right? Oh, yeah. So I think the problem is yeah, that it's the wrong directory, right? So if I look, I'm in my class directory, I forgot to cd. This is a rookie mistake, and goes to show anyone can make any kind of mistakes. Anyway, so now we're in the right directory, we're in the next demo. What was happening is this top class directory, I was trying to run it here, and there's no package JSON, or there is a package JSON. I don't know why there is, but this package JSON, whatever's in here, doesn't have that next because it wasn't built with next. So that's why it was failing. And now we're in the next demo directory in our shell. And so now if I run it, right, npm run dev, now it should work. Okay. So there's always a possibility of something that you don't expect going on. And sometimes it's a simpler thing than you would think. I was getting too into the weeds with it. It was simply that I was in the wrong directory. So easy fix. Okay, so now it's running, and you can see that, excuse me, you can see here that the command line isn't waiting for another command, and that's because it's busy running the server for me, right? And you can see that it shows the server that it's running at. So it's running at localhost on port 3000. You can change that. We're not going to get into that, but you might want to if you have multiple running at the same time. I usually don't. I'm working on one thing at a time, and so you'll probably not have that problem. But there's documentation on how to change that. But in most of my IDEs or shell, I can hit command on my Mac, and then it turns into a link I can click. So I'm going to go ahead and click that and open up my website. And we can see we have a running website with the Vercel logo and all this stuff, right? And this is handy to note too, because when you first start, before you change anything, this has some pretty good links in it, right? It has some templates, a link to learn more, the raw documentation, and a link to deploy, which we'll mention later. But if you want to deploy your app to be publicly accessible and show it off to the world, you can do that pretty easily with Vercel, who came up with Next. They made it real easy to deploy to their services. Okay, so this is what our default homepage looks like now that we have it running. And then the next step here is we're going to try the page, right? So what did we do? We created an About Us page. We got a little ahead of ourselves. We created this page called About Us. We haven't seen it in action. And so we know that the routing that we described has us in app, and the page is called About. So we should be able to go to app/about, unless I'm misremembering how the configuration works. And we should see an About Us page. So I'm misremembering that. So I think what we need to do actually, that's, I think that works with the pages router, but here we need to do it a slightly different way, where we say About. So apologize for the confusion there. What we're going to do is rename, we're going to move this into that About Us folder and then rename it. So, and I'll go back and describe that one more time, a little slower. But before we get into it, let's retry that. Okay, so it automatically reloaded for us. Okay, so what I did was, instead of app/about.js, it's app and then a directory called About. So your page, you're going to create a directory for the page name and then put a page.js in that directory. This is what happens when I go off script. I went off script and I was like, oh, we don't need to do a directory. We do. So we do, and when we're doing the app router, we need a directory, and we'll put a page.js, and then we can put other things inside that About directory that is specific to the About page, like a CSS module, for example, we can put in there, and it will only affect the About page. We may or may not do that later. I don't think we need to get into that just now. We did burn up a little bit of our extra time, so we'll continue on. Okay. So that's the About Us page, and we can see I kind of glossed over it real quickly, but let's go back. So here's our About page. It matches the code that we wrote for that. We have an H1 tag here with the title, and then the About Us page. And might be worth noting here, view page source, right? So if we look at the page source, we can actually see that it adds some stuff in here for us. It has things like fetch priority, and I won't get into all of this stuff, but it does a lot of stuff behind the scenes for you. But you can see also that in our header, we have our title. And I don't know if you remember the title and the description, but those come from this layout file we went through a little bit ago, right here. So it has these things built in automatically for how search engines handle your page and those kind of things. So don't forget about these things as you're building out your pages. Okay, so let's go back here. We're gonna we'll close this source, go back to our page, and we can see too. I won't refresh the page. It's kind of hard to show. Let me see if I can shrink this down. Let me just move it. Okay, so if I move that so you can see the page behind us here, and I open my page, I can change this, and it changes in real time because we're in development mode. So that's super cool, and it's super handy when you're doing things like CSS changes and testing things out like, well, maybe I want to make this an H2 instead of an H1, right? I don't know why you would want to do that necessarily, but there's some SEO benefits. But you can see it's broken, right? And you get some errors that show up, and it underlined the problem. Like it's smart enough to give you a good error. We're going to fix that problem real quick, though. So we fix the problem, and it reloads the page. Anyway, let's go back to an H1 tag on this. Also, there is a shortcut and some tools that can change it in both spots for you. I'm just not doing that right now. I kind of wanted to show how the errors work a little bit. Okay, so let's bring this back up full screen and move on to the next thing. So now we have a working page. We've gone through some of the concepts around that working page and how the development server works. Let's try one of the other concepts here, which is a link, the link component. So to use the link component, what we're actually going to do is create a new component that can be used throughout the website. So before we even create a link, let's create a component called, well, we'll do it as part of creating one. So what we'll do is we'll make a directory. You can do it from the command line, and I'll show that here real quick. Let me make sure I'm in the right place. Let's see. Hold on. Oh, I'm already in app. Okay, cool. So here I'm in a bash shell. It looks a little different, and that's because commands we want to do later, you can't do from a Z shell. You can, there's going to be a way around it. I just haven't researched that in time for the class. But what we want to do is we want to make a directory for components. So before we did it in the IDE with point and click, but if you're comfortable with the command line, you can do it this way. You can do it either way, right? You can right click on app and say create new folder, or I can just do it right here. And actually, I'm going to go back a directory. So this is our main directory. PWD shows me what directory we're in. So I'm in the next demo directory. Like I said, you don't have to do it from the command line. If you're comfortable with the command line, that's cool too. So we're going to make a new directory inside app. We'll make a new folder, and it's called, what is it called? Components. Okay, and then in components, we're going to create a new file. For those familiar, you can use a command called touch, and it makes an empty file for you. You don't have to. You can, again, you can go over here in app. Oh, I did that wrong. Look, I already messed it up. Did anyone catch what I did here? I created the components folder in the wrong place. See, it's outside of app. If you do that, you can just move it in app. Little click and drag fixes our problems. So yeah, I moved it. It should have been, the command should have been make dir app/components. But, you know, if you're comfortable with doing things with the mouse and that's easier for you, you can just right click and do it that way, which would have not created the problem that I had. Anyway, so we'll do that for the file, right? Let's just create a new file instead of using touch. If you're comfortable with the command line, you know the touch command, feel free to use it. But here we'll just create it this way, and we'll call this nav, and it's going to be a component. So this time it's going to be a capital N, because we're defining a component name here. And we'll call it nav.js. So this is our navigation. We could call it menu.js or something similar. I'm just going to call it nav. And inside of our nav.js, we're going to use the link component. So we need to import that. So the way we do that is we say import and we tell it what we want to import. And my autocomplete is saying, hey, I think you want to use a link. And so we're going to do that. And whenever we do an import like that, we want to double check that it's coming from the place that we really want it from. You may have eventually multiple things installed where something else has a component also called link, and you want to just double check you have the right one. I've had that happen before, and if you don't notice it, and you're trying to use it, and then it doesn't work properly, and you're just like pulling your hair out. But if you check at the time you import it, you can save yourself that trouble. So we're going to import it. We're going to use a similar pattern that we used before. So we're going to say export default function nav. Look, it wants to tell me what to do here. And I'm okay with it. I'm going to say, sure, let's do that. And then it's actually, look, it pretty much knows what, no, actually, it nailed it. It nailed it perfectly. So I'm going to let it autocomplete. For those of you having to type it in, we'll go through all this and go a little slower. And again, this is a good point, right? This is a little block of code here. It's a good point for me to remind you that if you're typing along and you're like, oh my gosh, stop. Just unmute and say that. Say, hey, can we pause for a sec? But I'll go a little slow here so that hopefully we don't have too many problems. So again, what we're doing here is we're creating a function. This function is called nav. This is our nav component. And we're going to, again, return HTML. So you do a return and open parenthesis, and then you say what HTML you want to return. And in this case, we're going to create a nav component here. Actually, I think I want that to be div. I think it didn't nail it. Let's make that a div. My bad. So we're going to make this a div, right? I'm not sure where it came up with nav. Sometimes the code completion with Copilot kind of makes things up or gets it from some memory from somewhere. Anyway, we'll create a div. Inside that div, we'll have an unordered list. And inside that unordered list, we'll have list items. And that's how we'll create a really simple menu. If you're really developing an app that you want people to use, you'll get a little bit more involved, but this is the simple way to go. And then here's where it's also a little bit drunk. We're going to, the link components replaces the need for, in this instance, for the A tag, right? So it's putting an A tag here, but we don't need that. We're going to get rid of that. And we'll get rid of it on about as well. So what we have here is, and it doesn't have to be all, these don't have to be all on separate lines, but it's a pattern. Love it or hate it, use whatever pattern you're comfortable with. But what we have here is two links, right? We have these unordered list items, and inside each list item is a link component. And in the link component, just like an A tag, we offer an href. Where is this going? This is going to the home page. And then the other one is the About Us page, right? Let's say About Us. And that's going to go to the About Us page that we created. So Copilot's smart enough to like find the About Us page and know that we want that as a link. So did it for us. And then, we close all these tags, right? So we'll take a second and see what that looks like. Oh, we have to actually put that somewhere, right? We created this navigation component, but it doesn't actually exist on a page. So what we want to do is we could go into our home page here, or sorry, our About page. We could add a nav component right here, but then it only shows up on the About page. It doesn't show up everywhere. And let me actually show you what that looks like and why that's a problem. So let's do this here. So I think we want to, let's see, we want to import components nav. So let's just do that here. I'm going to rip through this a little bit quickly because we're not going to, whoops, that's not what I'm in the mode of just hitting tab and accepting what it gives me. I don't want to do that. I want to import nav from components nav. And so what I was saying is we're going to go kind of quickly because we're not keeping this change, right? We're going to just put it in here real fast. So we want to do a nav. Let's put it right here. Let's just put a nav right there. Oops. Okay. So now we have a nav in our about page. And let's see what that looks like to us. So great. We have our navigation. We have 2 menu items here, right? But what happens though when we go to the home page? The menu's gone. So that's why we want to use it in the layout instead of in the individual page. So what we'll do is we'll go back. We'll go back into our code here. I'm going to undo this change. I'm going to, instead of Control Z, I'm just going to delete these. So we're going to undo that change out of the about page. And if we look, it's gone, right? And now we're going to go into the layout page that we looked, the layout JS that we looked at before. That's in the root of your application. And we're going to do the same thing here as we just did there. So we're going to import, nav, right, from components nav. And it's kind of grayed out right now. It's a little lighter or a darker color because it's not used yet. And then down here in our HTML, let's change our body a little bit because it's going to get messy if we try and do everything on one line forever. So let's do that, split it out. And then in our body tag, it's my co-pilot here is suggesting I want a navigation there. It's kind of smart sometimes not. So we'll go ahead and add that. So we just add the nav tag all by itself. Nothing else to put in there. There may be times where you would want to pass variables into a component. You can do those things too, but we don't need to do that here. And you would do it kind of like this, right? Where you have a variable defined and then you can use it inside the component. We won't do that here. We'll get into that in the next portion. And we are running a little long now, so I'll kind of go a little faster. Anyway, so nav, we now have in place. And now if you notice, when we go to the home page, it's still there because it's part of our default layout. Okay, cool. So let's move on to the next piece, unless anyone needs me to stop. We'll go on to the next thing we had is a dynamic route. So here we're going to create a directory, and we can do this in the command line. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip the command line and just create the directories that we need here. So much like the about directory, which I'll minimize, we're going to create a new folder, and we'll call it blog, right? So we want a blog so we can share all our thoughts and feelings about Next.js. And inside our blog, it's empty. But we want to create a page structure. Now for this, for a dynamic page, what we want to do is we want to tell Next.js that we want these pages to be dynamically served based on the URL. And so to do that, we're going to use a folder. We'll create a new folder. And it has this bracket syntax where we can say whatever the variable name is that we want to call it. In this case, we'll call it, in my notes I wrote ID, but we're going to call it slug because that's the common term for the URL portion in a blog. And so we'll call it slug, and that identifies what part after blog. So you have your URL/blog/something. And it might be learn-next-js, right? And that part's the slug. And what this does, we create this directory called slug. And now when we create a file called page.js inside, page.js, what we're going to end up with, so we have an empty page. We're going to do the same kind of thing as before, right? We're going to export. I'm going to let it autocomplete some things for me. But we're going to export a default function again. And we'll call it blog post, actually. Let's go change that. We'll call it blog post. So it's export default function, blog post, and then This is a function, so we're going to open that up as a function, and we're going to do our standard return stuff. And it's going to say this is a blog post, but we need to do something a little different here. I skipped a step. I actually skipped two things. Let me do the easy one first. We know we want this. We don't have to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway, because it's good to remember these things as you go, right? We almost forgot our navigation. So in our blog post, we want to have our navigation, right? So we almost forgot that. Let's put that in here like we did before. Oh, my bad. We don't have to do that. We put it in the layout. Let's get rid of that. My bad. Okay, that's why it wasn't in my notes. We didn't forget it. It's in the layout by default. We solved that problem for all of our new pages. Right. Okay, so once again, hat tip to the layout JS for that. Okay, so what we're missing here is the variable. Remember I said we can create a component and we can our function, we can pass variable into it. So here, Next.js has a default called params. It thinks it's going to be called slug, but it's actually called params. Next.js provides something called params, where you can use things like the slug parameter that we created here in our directory. And the way we use it is we can say at, and then we'll say what URL we want, what URL this blog post is at. So that's at blog / and then we want to inject our variables. So we do that with these curly braces, and we say params, or not paprika, where that comes from. Params dot. Now I'm getting hungry for lunch. We'll get this wrapped up. Don't worry. So we have params, and then what's our parameter? It's slug, right? So we have our slug. It doesn't want to autocomplete this for me, but this will work. Let's see. So what we're doing is we're saying in our blog post, we want the params to be available. And the parameter that we're using is called slug. And there's different ways you can do this with the URLs. You can kind of chain and nest these things. We're not going to get into all that, especially in the interest of time. But now we have a blog pattern. Not really a page, but it is a page. It's a dynamic page that works off of a slug pattern. So if we were to use any slug pattern, so it starts with blog because that's the directory it's in. And then inside blog, we have a slug directory, which represents whatever this is. And that's our URL. And as you can see, it auto-filled this portion with that. So if I say Next.js is cool, it's going to automatically fill that in, right? And you can use that in a number of ways. So if you're trying to do a database call, like maybe you have an API backend that your blog post is going to go use that slug to go get the content for a blog page. You can use the variables in that way, or just for displaying like this as well. So there is a little bit of caution with being able to display. I don't remember how much Next.js protects against this, but whenever you take anything from user input like this and you display it on the page, always at least research what precautions are built into the framework, and have your own sense of caution about just throwing any user input onto the page or into a SQL query or any of those things. That's just a general security practice. Any user input should not be trusted. Always double check it. I think Next.js handles it in this form though for you. Okay, so let's move on to the next thing. And this is this the last thing? No, we have two more things, so we'll try and get through them pretty quickly. The next one is the API example. Some of it is going to be new to us, so I'll try and go a little bit slower on this one, and then the image one's super easy. And then just to give you a sense of where we're at, we're going to do an API demo. And then we're going to demo the image tag, which is super quick. And then we'll have room for some questions after, I think, one slide and then questions. And then we'll have a final slide that has contact info after the questions. But Okay, so here, like everything else, we need a directory under app, and this will be a excuse me one second, my throat's getting real sore, so I need a cough drop. Okay, so we're going to create a new folder like we've done before, but this is a folder that is special for Next.js for API usage, and we'll see how that works. So inside our API folder, we're going to create a route folder, and I am going to go kind of ad-lib a little bit just in the folder name, because the one I wrote in my notes doesn't make sense. But let's create an API folder for I don't know, we'll call it post, right? Yeah, we'll do that. We'll call it post. So this is our post endpoint where we're going to get blog posts. And inside our post endpoint folder, we need a folder called, we need a file called route. And this is the time that you finally actually are forced to do some route creation in Next.js. Now you notice up until then, we haven't had to create any routes for any of these pages. They're automatically generated based on the file structure. But here is a separate kind of situation where with an API, we have a route called post, but we might want to, I'm going to rename this instead of post. I'm going to rename this to avoid some confusion. Hold on. I'm going to call it article. Okay. And there's a reason why. So inside of our article endpoint, we have, we're going to need routes. And those routes could be a get route where we get information from a database or a store of some sort, or there could be a post or a delete. So with APIs, API endpoints, you can have all sorts of things other than just get. But we're just going to demo get today. Okay, so here we're going to export an asynchronous function. We'll do asynchronous because we want to let it finish what it's doing before it returns data. And what it's doing could be a database call or something like that. So we'll do it async, which means wait for it to complete. I don't know why this is, that's not what I want. So we want an async function. And the function we're going to call is get, or we're going to create as get. So this is a get endpoint. We could have a post here or a delete, and they do different things, right? We'll just do a get. We'll try and get through this quickly, pun intended. And then in our get, we're just going to do a really simple. We're not going to return a status 200 hello world. We're actually going to use some stuff built in Next and do it a different way. So what we want to do is we want to return a response object. Response. Yep. And the response object we're going to return is going to be, let's do a JSON object. And there's definitely, as you can see, the autocomplete suggesting all sorts of things. There's definitely different ways you can do this. But we're going to use JSON's stringify command that turns this message into a string, just as an example of how to do this. And then we're also going to return some headers. It's suggesting them for us because we're using JSON. So we're going to return those headers. Excuse me. And then we need to wrap this function up with a closing brace, closing curly brace. So this is what this looks like. We return a response, and for that response, we're going to JSON stringify this JSON with a hello world message. And then we're going to give it headers. And there's different ways you can just return raw JSON, and you can return other things. You don't need to use this response object. That's how we're doing it here. And when you get into building an API, there's a lot more things that you're going to have to read up about. How to return different things, what headers you want to return. You're going to use application JSON if you're returning JSON. Maybe you're doing an API that doesn't return JSON for some reason. And then this header wouldn't make sense. You'll put in error checking and those kind of things. APIs are a little bit more, it's a whole separate topic. But this is how support for it works, right? You create your endpoint called article, and then you define the routes. And in here, we're going to define another route. I'm not going to spend much time on it because we're not even going to test it. But we might have a post route, right? And the post route, before it returns anything, is going to do another step where we say, here we would store things in a database, right? Yeah, yeah. So like a post route would be a little different. We're going to store an article in a database. In a get route, really, we wouldn't just be hard coding stuff, right? Oh, look, autocomplete saved me. Here we would fetch this article from a database, and we would have like an article ID or whatever. I won't get into that. That's kind of really getting into some API specifics. But this is how you set up routes for an API. And if we look at our application, we can actually make a call to that API by going to API / as you might guess, article. And then it's just a get route. We're not passing an ID or anything. Oh, and it broke for some reason. Cool. So why did it break? We can look in our logs and see that we got a 500 error, and we can see why we got a 500 error. And I might not dig into this too much because we're running short on time, but this is a good example of what happens when something doesn't work. You can go back to your running application and look. And I forgot something. Look at that. It tells me exactly what happened here, right? So we scroll up to the very first X, the red X, and that's our first hint. We could look through the whole stack trace, but usually that's a bunch of noise. We know it's a 500 error, which means there was a server problem. Usually that means somebody messed up their code. And in that case, we did, right? So I don't have to fix this one because we're not trying to hit that one, but I will. But I'm lumping the rest of you in on this. I forgot the new keyword. So we're creating a new response to send back, right? So if we save that, we can scroll that down, we can see it compiled fine. And if we go back to this, we can load it up and see our result. Okay, so there's our API result. Again, APIs are a whole other topic. If you're doing a lot of complex development, you're going to end up using APIs. It's handy to have them here. You don't have to have your API internal to your next app. You can have it completely separate. If you're doing an app that uses Google Maps, you might be hitting Google Maps API, right? So it may not even be your own API, but this, if you wanted to create your own API, which a lot of times you'll have a good need for it, that's how you would do it. Okay. So the next thing here is the image components. So let's try that out. Let's actually go back. You notice here also, this is an API, so we don't get our menu because we're generating a completely custom response outside of that layout. Because it's an API, you don't want all that layout in your API. So here we go back to, let's go to our About Us page. Wow, that's a super simple page. We want to add an image here of, what did I do? A MacBook, I think. So what we'll do, what did I drag over here? Oh, I put it in public. Where is it? MacBook JPG. Yep. Okay. So what we want to do is we want to add an image to the About Us page. Where is that? Oh, here's a good practice to close stuff you're not using sometimes. Let's close all this stuff and just go to our About page. Okay. So in our About page, let's just throw an image at the bottom here. So again, we're going to use the image components. And it's broken right now. It says it's fixed, but I want to see how well this works, right? So we have an image component. Let's get rid of that. It's not about, it's MacBook. MacBook. Oh, I'm hitting caps lock, not tab. Whoops. MacBook. I had it right the first time. .jpg, and all tags are always important, right? There are people who are vision impaired or otherwise can't see what's on the screen, and these things are good for accessibility. Always build accessibility in anything you're building. I'm gonna go the lazy route and just write MacBook here. And then we'll let it be 640 by 427. I don't think that's accurate. It's gonna be a little skewed. But that's all that is, right? We bring in this image component, and I think we're gonna need to import it. I think this will fail. Let's take a look. Yeah. So image is not defined. It says, I don't know what to do. And as I said, we'll need to import it here. So we just do an import. Import image from next image. And that solves our problem. It compiles now, and we have an image loading up of a MacBook. And then what that does for us is it makes it so that this image is optimized for use in the page, and you can do all sorts of things with the sizing of it to make it responsive and those kind of things. Okay, so quick time check. We started out a little fast, ran into a couple problems, and now we're right about on time, right? I had wanted to be done and be starting into the questions around 11:45. I think we're right about there. Let's take a breath though before I get into the next slide. Is anyone still catching up, or do you have questions? Not general questions, but related to the code that we just walked through that we can solve while we're here. I'm kind of watching for chat or any hands up or anything like that. Okay.
What would happen if you did not specify the width and height?
Oh, that's a great question. I did that, and I found out the hard way. It's required, but we'll do it. I like to answer the question, what would happen with actually doing the thing. So we'll save it, and right away you can see a problem with the About Us page, which is another good reason to keep the dev portal open, but you can also see here it failed. And it's pretty good about telling you why it failed. So Next.js tells you that, hey, you're trying to load this image, but you forgot the width property. So we have to add the width property in here because it's a component that requires it.
Okay, so
take cover property as well, I believe. So if you don't want to specify height and width, there's a couple other properties you can use that'll get it to work based on use case, of course.
Yeah, so let's
if you just put width without height, then it will be happy with it.
Nope.
Nope. Yeah, it's gonna require both. And so let's do this. I want to this is a good way to find out, right? Because I don't know the answer right off the top of my head, but Jacob, thanks for chiming in on that. We can actually go over here and go to the documentation, and we can look at in the API reference. Let me go a little slower. Scroll down to API reference. API means the programming interface, right? So all of the things that Next.js provides out of the box for you. And in that is your components. And then if we look at our image component, you can see the documentation on how to use it, right? So we can add in these are all the things that we already have in there. But these are the other properties. So we have our source property, we're already using that. We tried width and height. There's a loader property and some other things, right? But there's sizes. So you can give it a max width and some a little bit more complex things here where you can make it a little bit more responsive. You can give it a quality, right? If you don't want to load it at 100%, you want to reduce the quality so maybe it loads faster. Some images, maybe you have a ton of images on the page, you want to prioritize them. There's all sorts of things like that. What was the one you were mentioning, Jacob?
There's the fill, setting fill to true instead of using height and width. That'll get it to.
Yeah, there it is. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so yeah, so we can say fill true, right? And let's try that out and see how that looks. Thanks for chiming in on that. I forgot. I often forget about some of these things and how they work. Let's see if we got them right. So if we go back to the page, let's go back to something in my way again. There we go. Okay, so if we go back to the About Us page, now it's filling the whole screen, right? So there's definitely other things that you can do here. But that's a really, really good tip. And I'm glad you brought that up, Jacob. And I'm glad we had the question too, because that introduces the idea that, you know, you really should, even if you don't have the question, you really should go in and look at the documentation and see all the things that you can do. Like prioritization, right? You might not have ever even thought that was a thing, but now that we're looking at the documentation, it's something that you have in your back pocket when you're like, oh, I really want this other image to load faster than the other ones on the page. And so now I know I've got these this property. I remember seeing this property that does that for me. Same thing with like link. You know, link is a little bit less complicated, but you can see some things going on here that you can add to your link, like some prefetch option, and then like remember I said you can just not use the component if you don't want to prefetch. Well, maybe you want to use the component because of other advantages it has, but still not prefetch. You can turn that off. So yeah, there's some advantages there. Great question. Great help, Jacob, on that. Does anyone have any other questions? We'll actually let me move forward in our slides here. So let's talk about what's next. If you have questions, feel free. We still have a little time for them. But so you know, another pun here. What's next? What do you do with this knowledge, right? So I would say learn more about Next.js features. We just talked about going through the documentation and digging in a little bit on the components. If you want to know about the API, for example, you can read more about that. You can go into all the file conventions and functions. There's so much in here to read. I would just kind of skim through here and look at what seems interesting to you, or if you have something specific that you're looking for, you can search the documentation and dig into to something very specific, right? Like routing and defining routes. And so it's very helpful the way they have laid that out for you. And again, you can get to that from your home page, right? So just the default site has the documentation link. Okay, and then you know, discover more with it. Build stuff with it. Build an app. Like take a few hours and come up with an idea. If you want to see how static pages work, maybe try and build a poetry app with a couple poems in it. And just see how that works, right? If you want to see how the dynamic routes, if that was the most interesting thing today, how that route pattern worked, where we use the blog slug, dig into that a little bit and try and build your own custom dynamic route with some other idea. Try and do a chained, like a nested route with IDs, with 2 different slugs or something like that, right? And then try deploying it to Vercel. The last link here was deploy, which takes you to kind of a walkthrough on how to deploy your code. And if I remember the last time I had done this, I just hooked up my GitHub repository, and it has all sorts of hooks in it where you make a change, it automatically deploys your app to a staged environment, and you can have different environments and that kind of thing. But dig through that and try deploying an app and see how that goes. And then you know, just have fun building with Next.js. If you've used things like Angular or whatever before, do a web search for a comparison, or ask ChatGPT or one of the other LLMs to give you a breakdown comparison of the features. And you know, kind of make your decisions on where you think this would be good and where it wouldn't. So we already did have some time for questions. We will open it up to some more questions now, and while we do that, I'll post some links here I think Julianne has these links that she posts in chat as well. We do have additional classes and webinars that we try to plan 1 or 2 of these a month, and some are in a class format like this, some are in webinar formats. But if you follow us on Eventbrite, you'll see some of those come through. Our website is integral.io, where you can find out more about our company, Integral, and the things that we offer. We're a consultancy, we're software consultants, so we go into like an enterprise, for example, and we'll help them understand ways to improve their code and their process, and with the hopes of, eventually leaving that team in a much better place than we found them. And so that's what we do for a living, or as a company. And we have our YouTube, where we have these things posted, our videos and all these things. So the recording from today will be posted there. And then also we have a couple LinkedIn links at the bottom here. One is Integral's LinkedIn, and then my own LinkedIn if you want to connect with me if you have more questions later. And speaking of questions, the last few minutes here, do we have any questions about any of the concepts or any of the code that we went over? Or and it doesn't have to be a question too. If you have used Next.js, a feature that you like about it, feel free to chime in with that too.
So I've been working with Next.js for about 3 months now, and you touched on layouts, which are great. The thing that I love about is that you can actually nest layouts. And so that for each directory, you can have a layout within it, so that, say, if you have search bars or anything that you need popping up on subsection of pages, you can just layer them infinitely.
Yeah, so that's a great, I'm not going to, in the short time we have left, I won't try and do it as an example, but I'll mention an example that I think could come to mind.
Even if you actually copy paste the layout from the one you have into the other directory, it'll immediately show in the display, just as an example.
Yeah, okay, so let's do something real quick then. Let's say let's grab our layout and let's copy this guy over. That's a good point. We can just copy it in a blog, right? So the blog is what I was thinking, where that could be a good use case, where maybe on every one of your blog article pages, you want to show other blogs or an author section or something like that, right? Let's paste that in. Okay. So in blog, we have a layout, and here we're gonna, I'll just add some extra stuff in here. Let me actually put that. So if we wanted something specific in the blog as well, then what we can do is go, we don't have a link to our blog. Oh, we failed. What did we fail on? No, whoops. Imports are a little broken. We actually, I'm gonna take the nav out of the blog too, just for fun.
Yeah.
Okay. So now if we go to our blog URL that we had before, blog, we'll just go to anyone. So now we have our navigation that comes from our primary layout, but we also have this some text here that is going to show up in any blog page. That's a good point. We can just copy it over and make an example out of it that way. So that's a good point about nested layouts, right?
And then the other thing for layouts is using things like session providers or other providers, and being able to basically just have a state pass through your app really easily.
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely so and that goes really into also into what I mentioned before about reading through the documentation and looking at how some of that stuff works. So definitely read through, and you'll find that there's a wealth of things beyond this kind of 101 intro class that are available to you with Next.js. And it like you spent a few months working with Next.js, you can really learn a lot of cool tricks and magic that's built in. Yeah, thanks for bringing those up.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I love that in these classes there's always someone who has additional tips and tricks, and there's oftentimes people who are smarter than I am about some of this stuff too, and it's great. I never want to be the smartest person in the room all the time, or anytime really. I love to have people around me that know more than I do about stuff. So I'm glad I was reminded about some of that stuff. And I think Jacob, I'm sure you know some stuff I don't know as well that I haven't experimented with.
I guarantee you it's a two-way street, 100%
Yeah.
certain about that.
Yeah, it usually is. Okay. All right. So with that, I'm gonna say let me get to my back to my slide deck here. So that was our last slide. I want to say thanks to everyone for showing up on your Saturday and learning something new with me, and thanks for the questions and the contribution along the way as well.